I'm going to be talking about our experience in building the world's first museum and memorial to the Partition. So this is the Partition Museum in Amritsar. So I think since you're all here, we don't really need to spend too much time talking about the Partition, but the reality of what Partition was, but the reality is that Partition was an event in which some 12 to 18 million people lost their homes. Nobody actually knows how many people had to lose their homes. Nobody knows how many people died. Estimates vary from 200,000 to up to 2 million people. But what we do know is that Partition was the largest mass migration in human history. Yet despite this, 70 years after Partition, there was no museum or memorial anywhere in the world that remembered this event. Where Partition has appeared in museums or archives, it's been at the level of the leaders, Nehru's, the Nehru Memorial in Delhi, etc. But Partition was not only their story. It was a story of all those millions of ordinary people who had to pack up whatever they could into a suitcase and flee. It was the story of having to find whatever means of transport you could, whether that was walking scores of miles in what was one of the worst monsoons. So imagine, not only have you had to flee, it's pouring rain, you have no shelter, you have no food, there's no sanitation, you're vulnerable to attack. So how have we got 70 years without remembering this story? So 2.5 years ago, we started working on building the Partition Museum and making it as a people's museum. This is the stunning building that we're in. It's the town hall in Amritsar. It's located just a quick 10-minute walk from Darbar Sahib, 5 minutes from Jallianwala Bagh. And it's got a very, it's got a lot of history itself, so it makes it a very apt home for the Partition Museum. So what we're trying to do in the museum is use people's objects, their voices, their letters, their photographs, to tell the story of what happened with those millions of people who were impacted at Partition. This is one of my favorite stories that we have in the museum, so I thought I'd share it with you. This has actually been in the Curtain Raiser exhibition that's been open for the last 8 months or so. This Phulkari coat belonged to a woman called Preetam Kaur. She was 22 years old when Partition happened. And when the violence started, like so many other families, her family decided to send her ahead to safety. So they put her on a train with her 2-year-old brother. And somehow, by herself, she managed to make her way to a refugee camp in Amritsar. Now, before Partition had happened, she was engaged to be married. But in the chaos, they lost contact with her fiance's family. As fate would have it, in the long, winding line for food at the refugee camp in Amritsar, she ran into her fiance again. He too had had to flee the violence. Unfortunately, he lost some of his siblings along the way, but he had arrived at that same camp. She was carrying this Phulkari coat. Now you have to remember, as I said before, it's the monsoons, it's hot, it's humid. This is not a very practical item to be carrying with you, but it was just one of her favorite things. So when she left, this is what she chose to take with her. And this briefcase was carried by her fiance, Bhagwan Maini, and in it he brought his property papers and his school certificates. So we've placed these items side by side in the museum as a testimony to the life that they lost and found together at Partition. We have a well in the museum, so what we're trying to do in the museum is make it a multimedia museum. We find that a lot of museums in India, you go and there's one object and there's another object and there's another, and there's no clear sense of why you're looking at something. So we're trying to tell a story through the museum. And we're telling that story using multiple different mediums, like we have a lot of first-hand testimonies playing in the museum of people who experienced Partition themselves. We have their objects and their photographs and their letters, as you just saw. We also have installations. So this is the first version of the well, and it's a memorial to all the women who were lost at that time. We also, in our final gallery of the Curtain Raiser, our last gallery in the museum is called the Gallery of Hope, because despite the difficulties that people went through, we want in the last gallery to acknowledge the fact that a lot of people rebuilt their lives And so to pay a tribute to that and say, how do we move forward from here? So it's a contemporary gallery. It's a gallery that looks forward and says, what now, what next? The central installation in that gallery is this Tree of Hope. And this is what it looked like when we opened on October 24th last year. And this is what it looked like 5 weeks later. It's an interactive installation, and people can come in and share their messages on it. So these are some of the ways we're trying to make this kind of a more experiential museum.
Okay, so today I'm going to talk to you about how storytelling and oral histories are changing our perception and understanding of partition. So let me just go back really quick to these other events that we know very, very well. Let's look at the Holocaust in Europe and Hiroshima, Nagasaki, the bombing of Hiroshima, Nagasaki. Now, these particular events are really, really well studied and well understood around the world. And part of the reason is that we have witness accounts for these events. So these events have changed our understanding of human rights. They've changed our understanding of nuclear war, or the potential destruction that can happen with nuclear war. They've led to nuclear non-proliferation movements. They've led to the UNHCR. However, we here, all of us here, are heirs to one of the largest mass migrations, and yet we do not have voices from this event, and we have not learned from it to the extent that we could. Just to show you the numbers again, which you just heard from Malika a second ago. So the approximate numbers are from 1946 to 1948, we had almost 15 million people migrate. And if you go up over the next decade, that's almost 20 million or more people, according to recent research. So that's almost 1% of the world's population at that time. Those numbers are really huge. The number of people affected, if you look at the whole subcontinent, because people migrated everywhere, as our oral histories are now telling us, that's about 14% of the world's population. That's massive, so it's not a number we can ignore. And the number of people who perished, we still don't know. These are just rough, approximate numbers. And so the problem is that we did not have a primary source of witness accounts. That was a problem that we recognized about 10 years ago. And the remaining witnesses at the time were in their 80s and 90s, and that number was decreasing very quickly. So it was an urgency now or never. And just so that we don't take this moment for granted, the fact that all of us here are remembering partition, this was not the case 10 years ago. Partition was a memory that was dying away. And so what I wanted to do was give you just a 2-minute background on the archive and all of the work done by hundreds of people that's bringing this history out into the public and making moments like this today a reality. And it's actually very, very exciting for me to see so much interest in partition, because we work tirelessly to ensure that this history is not forgotten. It was the inspiration that I had in Hiroshima. I was finishing my PhD at the University of Tokyo, and I took a trip down to Hiroshima, and I saw the oral history archives, and I was very, very deeply moved. I had read books on Hiroshima, I had watched films, but when I heard the people's voices, those moved me to the core, and I could not stop thinking about it. I realized at that moment that to give an event legitimacy, you really needed to hear from the survivors, because those stories hit you on a visceral level. Those stories inspire more research. They inspire the scientific work. They inspire the sociological work to understand a particular event. And I realized in that moment that if people heard about partition from my grandmother directly, they would take it much more seriously. And that was the birth of the idea to create the Partition Archive. And then fast forward to about a year later, I, along with a number of other crazy fools, we took our vacations off, and we just literally, this is us in Amritsar going from shop to shop back in 2010, looking for witnesses to interview. So basically, I'm going to talk about how this idea of crowdsourcing came about for oral histories. So we basically were a bunch of either graduate students or postdocs. We didn't have money, we didn't have political clout, we didn't have sort of the tools that we needed to build this archive of oral histories. So we thought about what we could do with modern technology, and the idea of crowdsourcing was born. Well, what if we teach other people like ourselves all over the world how to record these stories, with the expert tools that we had, and then together, all of us would come together to build this history so that it is truly a history built for people by people. So all of us would need to come together to document this history. And hence was born this concept of crowdsourcing. We basically teach people everywhere how to record these stories, and together we provide a platform for these stories to be posted and saved for posterity. Some pictures from the very early days, we basically ran around everywhere trying to sell this idea because it was not so accepted 10 years ago. People thought it was a very crazy idea to want to preserve the memory of partition. But after hundreds of us have been doing this, it has become more acceptable. There's almost 1 million followers on our Facebook page. That just goes to show how this conversation has started to go viral. In 2013, I left my job. I was doing postdoctoral research at Lawrence Berkeley National Lab in Berkeley, California, and the University of California at Berkeley to do this work full time. So here's how it works. We basically train people how to record stories. Anyone, anywhere can log on to our free workshops online, record the stories, upload them to our portal, and we have support from a number of tech companies who are helping us make that possible because these videos are very large. And then we share them in the community, which inspires even more people to come and record stories. And it inspires cross-border conversations. In fact, tons and tons of old friends and family have connected over our Facebook page because they've seen somebody's story getting posted, and then they found old friends. And that, when moments like that happen, it's pretty incredible. So basically, with this crowdsourcing method, another thing that happens is stories not only get preserved in the archives, suddenly they gain importance within the family, within the younger generation, and they gain importance within the community. So here's how it works. So if you go to our website now, you can click on any one of these cities. You can see stories from that city, where people migrated to from that city, and you can click on a particular story, and if we have videos up, you can watch videos of that oral history. Just to give you a glimpse of one of the fascinating things, one of many, many fascinating things that's coming out from the stories. So when I grew up, I learned that there was one giant India that was broken into 2 pieces during partition. It turns out that that's really not the case. There was a British India, and remember, India is not even a native South Asian word. It's an English word of Greek origin. There was a British India, which is the pink areas, and then there was a lot of native kingdoms. Many of them had treaties with the British. And those kingdoms become really, really important when you're looking at the people's history because people's cultures and their association with the British government changes according to whether they're living in British India as subjects directly of the British or whether they're living in their native kingdoms. And there's some fascinating cultures that have sort of been brushed under the carpet, fascinating histories, because we have preserved this very one-dimensional history of partition and South Asia. Just to give you a glimpse at some of the Maharajas and the interesting stories from back then. Another interesting thing that comes out is the British Empire in India. So basically, the British territory, if you look here on the extreme right-hand side, that brown area about 200 years ago is British India. So this history isn't even really that old and that long. Just to give you a glimpse of some of the people that I've interviewed. So to show you my ignorance, I thought sitar was an specifically Indian instrument when I was younger, and when I interviewed this man, this is long, about 10 years ago, when I interviewed this man who was Pakistani and he played the sitar, I foolishly was like, oh, I didn't know you played sitar in Pakistan too. That just goes to show the kind of, the kind of histories that social histories that we've grown up with. Obviously, I know much, much better now. So this gentleman, he was, when I interviewed him, he was 107 years old, he's no more. And he told me a fascinating story about chai. So I always thought that chai was a staple in South Asia, but what I learned from him was that he, to this day, boycotts chai because in the 1920s, so he's from Punjab. In the 1920s, all these young men in Punjab used to boycott chai because it was the East India Company, which they believed was going around and spiking people's milk with chai to get them addicted. So it was not like a staple drink in South Asia until the East India Company popularized it. So I thought that was really fascinating to learn. Of course, there's a lot of other things. I'm just giving you small cultural glimpses beyond partition that you learn from recording oral histories. So here's just a family with very ancient musical traditions that were disrupted by partition because they had to move. Here's somebody who makes old handmade rababs and kamichas, which are also very ancient instruments. And you see a lot of these histories getting disrupted, a lot of these traditions, heirloom traditions getting disrupted by partition. And that's something that the archive tries to capture. So to give you a glimpse at our team, so we have over 500 citizen historian volunteers. These are people who have generously donated their time, including many who are in this room right now that I just met and was very deeply honored to meet. And we also have over 50 scholars. So scholarships are funded by ordinary citizens, and we have this very competitive program where people apply to become scholars. Once they get the scholarship, they go to a specific region and record stories for a given period of time. We've been running that program for several years now, and our scholars have gone on to do incredible things later on. And this is, these are not the scholars or the citizen historians, but this is to give you a back-end vision of our team, a version of our team. So this here, this here at the bottom, that's a glimpse at a portion of our Berkeley team. So this is a team of archivists. There's 18 archivists, and they're constantly receiving these stories as they come in from around the world. And it takes about 4 hours to archive one story. So they work very, very hard at doing that. And then on the top left, you actually see Anchal, who you're going to meet shortly. She's on the extreme left there. She's been curating a number of exhibits that will be coming up in Delhi based on the oral history. So if you're in Delhi later this month, definitely stop by India Habitat Center and a number of other places, Beaconer House and so on. On the far right is our team that's managing the scholarship program out of the Make My Trip office in Gurgaon. Make My Trip has been generous enough to give us space there. So in this way, we've recorded over 4,300 oral histories. That's about 8,000, more than 8,000 hours of video footage from 350 cities around the world in 22 languages. And there's over 700,000 people following the stories on social media, and over 10,000 people who've actually viewed these stories. You can get these statistics these days from social media. And over 3,500 people just this year who've left comments on the stories. Our goal is to record at least 10,000. We're already the largest oral history collection in South Asia, and we are one of the largest video-based collections in the world. Not the largest, but one of the top 10. So the archive has helped, along with many other efforts, to really popularize the preservation of oral histories of partition. I mean, there's a lot of little nuanced things that have come out from all the people that have volunteered for this. For example, even capitalizing the word partition, when we first started, we were told over and over again that this should not be capitalized, but we really wanted it to. We felt that capitalizing it would give it global significance, so we would insist on it over and over, including with any media coverage we had. And today, I see everywhere that partition is indeed capitalized, so that's kind of cool. So those kinds of little things that come out when you have a lot of people working together on something. So thank you very much. You're welcome to join us in making this possible. Take one of our classes, record an oral history. It's a deeply moving experience, so do it just for that, if not for the archive and for posterity. And if you've got stories in your family, definitely look us up and make sure that you preserve them. Thank you.
So, hi everyone. It's really nice to be here in Bombay, where so much of Sindhi culture came from across the border, and so much of Sindhi culture got lost along the way. I'm really excited to be talking to you guys about a very small part of the partition that has been virtually unarchived till now. I'm here to talk to you about objects, which is really fitting because there is a museum of objects that the Culture Lab has created here. But before that, I'm going to give a little context of partition and talk about memory. So human memory is very fragile. We experience moments, and those experiences get stored in our bodies as memories. But not everything we experience becomes a mnemonic trace of that moment. So memory is flexible, it is malleable, it is changeable. And over time, memory, especially traumatic memory, does change. Partition memory is particularly pliable, wherein the act of remembering is as important as the act of forgetting, sometimes on purpose, sometimes because we just can't bear to remember. For those who witnessed an event as colossal as the partition, there is a reluctance to remember. How do you tell people about it? What words do you use? How do you describe what you saw? How do you describe what you felt? For the most part, you yourself have forgotten how to feel those things. So what happens to generations that come after people who have experienced partition, second and third generations who have just read about it in academic textbooks, watched it in films, heard about it, on the, I don't know, songs and so on. How do you deal with the word partition when you don't have any first-hand experience of it? What do you use to make the tangible connect? What do you use to feel what your grandparents feel? What do you use to understand that maybe someone living in what has become Pakistan or what has become Bangladesh is really not so different from you? You use tangible things that remain from that time. The object is an enormous resource to understand society from a certain time that we cannot go back to. The way to remember a home or a place of belonging from an object that remains from that place is an incredibly unexplored way to look at belonging, belonging through belongings. Apart from the person that migrated, the tangible object is the only thing that remains from their home, from their soil. What someone carried, how much of it they carried, how could they carry, are all factors that show us how people lived. If somebody had wealth, if somebody worked in the government, if somebody knew partition was going to happen, they likely took many things, and they likely took them before the riots began, sent them on the goods train. If someone knew about partition but didn't believe it was happening, and when there were riots in their mohalla, someone said, 3 ghante, 3 hours, you have to leave. What can you pack in 3 hours? And moreover, what have you packed? How do you feel about that 70 years later? How does your family feel about that? What is your relationship to the object as the decades have passed? And what if you didn't know about partition at all? What if you could take nothing? What if you had to leave everything behind? What if you took something as absolutely mundane and yet many years poignant as soil? What if you took a book? What if you took a pen? Those are very mundane objects. So how do objects of incredibly mundane nature gain their rightful importance in history? Who gives it to them? We give it to it. Third generations give it to us. Second generations give it to them by celebrating these objects. As you have seen, there are many different kinds of objects that people carried. Some that have been forgotten for many years, some that I had to literally drag out of cupboards, out of glass cases, into the public sphere of the family itself. There are objects that family members didn't know existed. There are objects that have made grandparents and grandchildren talk. There have objects that have had fights in families because people didn't know of what they brought. So let's talk about the different kinds of objects people brought. Obviously, there are things of value. Jewelry is a popular thing. People were going to a new life. They didn't know what means they would have. They took things that were valuable so that they could sell them. Now, that's another thing that many people couldn't sell the jewelry that they brought, maybe because it was, family heirloom jewelry or jewelry that had been given at the time of their wedding. So these remain incredible traces of family life. There were, much to my surprise, documents, books. People brought lots of certificates. So it's a form of identification. There was a certificate here going around of a railway clerk. He thought he would get the same job when he came to India. What I want to do is go through some of these objects and the stories attached to them. Photo albums. Somehow, I don't know, you think about it for yourself. If you're going to leave your home, what's the one thing that you take with you? Obviously, what we take now is not the same thing that they would have taken then. This woman used to write poetry, you can see 21st August 1947. She continued to write poetry during the partition. This is something that my mother's family brought from Lahore that my great-grandfather had brought from an Englishman in 1933. She hardly ever wears it. This is an interesting story of a man who witnessed independence on a ship back to India. He went with his family for the Grand World Tour, and that is a menu card. This is my grandmother, whose mother brought the Mang Tikka. Her husband had died very early in life, and his mother had given it to her, and she never wore it either, except at her wedding. But she brought it to India to sell. She could never sell it. Old photographs again. It's very interesting to see how these objects, especially documents and photographs, teach us about the life. How do people look? How have we changed? How does the photograph remain a trace of them? A woman brought a knife that she was given in D.I. Khan to protect herself, and now she cuts aloe vera with it. A ghada that was used to make lassi in Lahore, and is still used to make lassi in Delhi. This is a khastan. Who knows what a khastan is? It's a very age-old thing of pan making. When you make the pan, you put it in the khastan and you present it to a khas guest, a special guest. And then a person picks it up, takes the pan, says adab, and eats it. So, through this research, you're tracing social ethnography through tangible things. There is so much to learn. I don't need to tell you what all there is to learn about partition, because you obviously have heard already, and you will hear again. And you will hear for many years, because now we're actually in a race against time. We're people that have witnessed partition, that have lived through it, will not be alive for much longer. That's the unfortunate reality. And we must make the most of the time that we have with them, not only to archive their memories, but also to remove our own prejudice about the other. When I went to Pakistan, first of all, what was I expecting when I went? Nothing other than the same as in India. But actually, it's true. People really are the same. We other the other without knowing that we are othering the other, and that is because we don't have knowledge of the other. The way we are taught history in school is biased. The way we learn from, in college is not the truth. Academic history will not give you the whole thing. Not to say that oral history of, history of people will give you the full picture either. It is to be seen in totality with each other. Oral history does not exist in isolation from academic history, in the same way academic history does not exist in isolation from oral history. We need to learn from each other. We need to speak to people. I'm not going to go on my spiel any longer, but what I'm going to say is if you have an object of age in your house, look at it, touch it, feel it, smell it. Try to imagine what it would have been used for. Try to speak to the person who owns it. It will teach you something about yourself. Thank you.
So I was raised in a very secular and cosmopolitan Bombay, and what I was intrigued by was how in the 1990s, Hindu-Muslim conflict changed the city of Bombay. And this was at a time when India was being economically liberalized. So at the time, this seemed to me contradictory. This movement on the one hand towards globalization and economic liberalization, and then on the other hand, this movement to embrace what seemed to me old ethnic identities of Hindu and Muslim. So as I started investigating this issue, it became increasingly apparent to me that something important had happened in 1947, but had not quite been accounted for. It seemed to me that the partition of the subcontinent marked a decisive shift in how we think about identity and belonging in India. These are some of the literary and film works that I analyze in my book, Violent Belongings. Violent Belongings as a whole shows how, in the face of state censorship of refugee voices, and in the absence of any state initiatives to memorialize partition, it was the writers and filmmakers of the subcontinent that became our storytellers and story gatherers. It was the writers and filmmakers who bear witness to partition, and they reveal to us how partition continues to haunt South Asia. In a very profound sense, our literary archive, like some of the exhibits here today, reanimate partition. This archive chronicles partition's ordinary memory and also makes its ongoing human suffering for migrants and citizens legible. It insists, more importantly, that we rethink how we talk about, how we story the 1947 partition, aesthetically, ethically, and politically. Not as something that happened in the past and is done, but as Vishwajyoti Ghosh says, as something, quote, that is still happening across all three countries, unquote. The Nigerian author Chimamanda Adichie has noted, many stories matter. Stories have been used to dispossess and malign. but stories can also be used to empower and to humanize. Stories can break the dignity of a people, but stories can also repair that broken dignity. In his book, Nothing Ever Dies, the Pulitzer Prize-winning Vietnamese-American writer Viet Thanh Nguyen describes what he calls an ethics of memory. This is, quote, a just memory that strives to remember both one's own and others, unquote. Our literature eloquently documents this just memory. Ethically memorializing partition involves then taking collective responsibility for partition, as the pioneering work of Gunita Bhalla showed when she launched the groundbreaking 1947 Partition Archive in 2009. It means we engage partition not as someone else's history, not as just familial history, not as regional history, the history of that Punjabi or Bengali or Sindhi family, but as a history that is intimately our own. It belongs to all of us. And there are different models that come to mind when you think about how to memorialize events like this, like the partition, like the Holocaust, like Hiroshima. And there are two models that come to mind, the German model and the American one. Now, the German one entails a kind of institutional commitment on the part of the state to remember and commemorate the Holocaust, and to incorporate the remembering, the storytelling within state practices, within institutions, and within civil society. Hence, for instance, Germany today conserves over 2,000 memorial sites bearing witness to the Holocaust experience. Dialogues about different dimensions of the Holocaust are incorporated into educational curricula, as well as community spaces. I like the German model, but we can talk more about this in the Q&A. What the stakes are for me in continuing this work on the partition was eloquently voiced last year by one partition refugee, Dr. Sagar Banka. Banka spoke at a Voices of Partition event held in Philadelphia that Gunita's archive, the 1947 Partition Archive, had organized at Aisha Khan's 12 Gates Art Gallery. For Banka, his family's experience of being forcibly displaced was mirrored today in the Syrian refugees' condition. He urged the audience that while these Syrians were being denigrated in media representations as refugees, we need to recognize that they are more than that label. They are, as his own father was, teachers, doctors, lawyers, engineers, human beings. Pointing to his and his wife's contributions to American society, he called for a more humane and inclusive response to today's migrants and refugees so that they too would have an opportunity to integrate and contribute to their new societies. In this way, the dialogue that day with Indian and Pakistani American witnesses joined partition to the present, where the remembrance of one's own past, one's own refugee past, also invoked the contemporary suffering of other migrants and other refugees today. Finally, as I've shared my work on partition across different campuses in the United States, I've come to discover that partition resonates not only for South Asians and South Asian Americans, but also for those who lived with the mid-20th century history of division and displacement that occurred across Asia. Right? And so I've heard stories from people who've said these partition stories remind me of how my father fled China and left for Taiwan and was separated from his family in 1949. And they thought they would go back after a few years, but they never were able to go back, and he didn't see his mother for 30 years. Other stories that I've heard have been about the division of North and South Korea in 1945. After all, then, the mid-20th century saw division and displacement unfolding across Asia in remarkably similar ways. and recognizing these connections, creating new conversations about displacement, about loss, about citizenship can be very generative for us. This might equip us to find a new way to live in the nation, to respond to today's refugees, and a new way perhaps to reinvent the politics of the present. Thank you.
A large section of the business community from Karachi, especially girls, to escape the violence, opted to come by sea because the sea did not have so much of rape and destruction. I know this because my mother came from that side. Okay? That's one. Two, the Sindhis who landed at Bombay were quite different. In many ways, they were different from the rest of the people who suffered from partition. The Sindhis actually contributed to the most amazing developments of Bombay. The Cooperative Housing Society was a Sindhi contribution to Bombay. Second, the best educational institutions in Bombay, Jai Hind, KC, all the HR, were actually Sindhi contributions. Somewhere they lost that vision. But that is something they brought and they wanted to develop in India after the partition, just gathering all the strength together to revive a new culture.
Can I say something on that? Yes. I conducted an interview once with a Sindhi woman who carried a hammam dasta. And there was a photograph, but I don't want to talk about that hammam dasta. I want to talk about what you said. She said something very poignant to me about loss of culture. Because the Sindhi culture has dissipated. Whether we like it or not, it has dissipated, and there are some advances to bring it back to life with the younger generation, but let's see. Anyway, what she said is the word Batwara, division. Punjab was divided, both sides. The land was on both sides, so Punjabi language remains. Bengal was divided on both sides, so Bengali language remains. Sindh is on one side. No Sindh was carried. Language, food, habits, smell, sight, touch, feel, all is connected to land. You lose your land, you lose your belonging, right? So at the beginning of my presentation, I said so much of Sindhi culture came to Bombay and so much of Sindhi culture got lost in the sea route. From Karachi, 2 days it takes, from Karachi to Bombay by sea in 1947-48. That's when the Sindhis came, and they lost much of that culture along the way, unfortunately.
Just to add that in the museum also, we are trying to profile, even though the museum is in Amritsar, it does cover both the Punjab and Bengal divisions as well as the Sindhi experience. So we've collaborated with an author who's researched specifically on the Sindhi experience. And as you said, Sindh had a very different experience of partition than Punjab, for example. In Punjab, you see most of the migration happening between August and around November, December. By then, almost all the populations have shifted. In Sindh, actually many people choose not to migrate until an event on January 6th, 1948 in Karachi. And that becomes a trigger for a lot of people to move. And so that difference in the experience is important to understand. And so in the museum, we have tried to include that story. We have tried to profile Ulhasnagar, just 60 kilometers or so from here, and how these Sindhi camps came up across the country and then went on to become actually Sindhi settlements to today. And so even today, the enterprising nature of the Sindhi community is such that the Nandita, who's helping us on this, was saying that by 1952 in Ulhasnagar, there were like 3 cinema halls and 3,000 shops because people had the spirit of saying, how do we pick up our lives and start again over here?
Hi. I'd also like to state the example of perhaps other communities who resided in Sindh, as it was called before partition, but deeply identified with the culture. And for this, I'd like to quote the example of my own family. My father's family came to Bombay from Sindh, from Karachi. I think they had to leave in sort of 3 weeks' time. My father was 16, and his family lived in Bombay ever since. But right from the time we were growing up, we're from UP, my father's family is originally from UP, he always told us that we are Sindhis. He said, I was born in Karachi, in Sindh, and we're actually Sindhis. So perhaps there are some stories of other communities and who identified
and actually, Sindhis
deeply
had
with
nothing,
this
like
culture.
they didn't have any interest between Hindu or Muslim.
Right.
It was Sindhi before anything else.
Absolutely, absolutely. And we all love Papar.
As Anchal talked about how difficult it is to talk to actual partition survivors, my question is, how do you understand the difference between actual memories versus constructed memories that build up over the years?
Do you want me to answer that? When I was doing my research for my book and before that, I tried to divide the different kinds of memory I encountered. So it's pretty obvious that memory does fade after a while. You know, maybe you've also experienced that you think that you've experienced something as a child, and then your mom is like, no, actually it was like that, and you're like, no, I remember it was like this. So I witnessed political memory, memory of the state. I witnessed social memory, which is collective memory. I witnessed, of course, memory of land getting divided, people talking about all those memories. And then I witnessed a third kind of memory that takes years to ferment, which is this kind of semi-displaced memory between fact and fabrication. And I think there is a very thin line, and I don't think that you can trust it entirely, which is why academic study comes hugely in help while at least writing about partition. I remember when I was doing my interviews, I would record everything, yes, and people would tell me, for instance, you know, on 29th August, I saw Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru standing on the banks of River Ravi saying Purn Swaraj, but then I had to go reference that in an archive. Did that really happen? You know, so I think it's very important, and I mentioned in my presentation as well, that academic study and oral history do not work in isolation from one another. So in my opinion, it's difficult to trust memory because memory becomes unreliable after a while. Yeah.
So I can add a little bit to that. Okay. So actually, if you have a lot of memories from a lot of different people, if you have an archive with a lot of stories, you can also cross-check. So that's a really straightforward way of determining. But yeah, actually oral history is considered academic as well. So you just, different types of record keeping, either oral or you have documents, but as she said, you would check with documents as well.
I have a question, and that question's really about partition and the effect it's had on the politics of identity. Because at the core of what you see happening here and on the other side of the border to our west, our great neighbors in Pakistan, is the whole issue of identity, is it not? I mean, for example, take something like, it was a revelation to me that the language I really spoke was Hindustani. It was not Hindi. It was not Urdu. And you have to sort of interact with the Arab or a Pakistani to, come to that moment of epiphany. So any comments on the politics of identity?
Yes.
Because to me, unless you resolve the politics of identity, I mean, this is great. But you're still going to carry that baggage, because what happened at the partition was almost a sort of rent of self, where we sort of forgot the cultural fabric that we originated from and sort of sought refuge in the identity that came from another source. Sorry, I mean, I hope that's not too long-winded.
I can comment on that because I think that is the crux of what we get from the oral histories. It is the politics of identity, as you say. So I think it was not during partition, what we learned from oral histories, from if you listen to thousands of them, it was not during partition that identity changed. It's over the next couple of generations, because even people, at least a lot of the people that we've talked to, those who witnessed partition, it wasn't, they were not the ones who were, identifying themselves as Indians or Pakistanis. They identified themselves as that much later. They identified themselves usually very regionally. A lot of people who lived in villages had no idea what India was or Pakistan was. They had not heard of either country, even until after partition. And so you see these identities constructed through excellent marketing over the next couple of decades, and we today are what you get, and our understanding and our thought process is what you get after decades of constructed identity. And I think that's why oral history is so important. Helps us go back and understand that, oh, this thing that I'm so passionate about being Indian or being Pakistani, wait, my grandparents had no idea. It's not even like such an ancient idea. And so then you learn to recognize it as an idea by, okay, Pakistan was born in 1933 in a dorm room in the UK. And, same with India. It was the River Indus and everybody living east of the River Indus. That's how the Europeans identified people living on this side. So, yeah.
I was just going to add that in the museum, where obviously we've got a strong focus on people's stories, and that's what I really spoke about today. But in addition to that, we also have a lot of government files, etc., looking at what was happening at the partition. So one very interesting thing related to what you were saying is the division of culture that happened at the time of partition, and how in a things like Mohenjo-daro, who does that belong to? Something that was a shared history and heritage that was so ancient. So at the time of partition, we've got these stacks and stacks, hundreds of pages of government files talking about how do you divide this culture. And so there are all these letters going up back and forth, and some are saying that, well, all these objects that are in the Delhi Museum just now, because they're in Delhi, therefore they belong to India, and Pakistan's writing, no, territorially they belong to Pakistan. And in a very tragic attempt at dividing culture, I don't want to give the game away about things you'll see in the museum, but I'll give you this example. In a very tragic attempt at dividing culture, there were some Mohenjo-daro necklaces that were divided down to the last bead. They literally took apart a necklace and said, you get these many beads, and you get so many beads. And so that's, I think, just a kind of a metaphor for what you were saying, that there is this attempt at dividing something that was very syncretic before.
It was actually in 1946, a new batch of ducks had been ordered from England that had to be divided between India and Pakistan.
Can I just add something real quick? That was a terrific point. And I think one of the things that I discovered in looking at the cultural representations and the responses to partition at the moment was the moment you have a political discourse which is about dividing land on the basis of religious majority belonging, so that Pakistan is going to be Muslim majority and India is going to be Hindu majority, even if both countries are going to claim to be initially secular, you have created a space within the political discourse that allows you to connect national belonging and religious identity. And that the creation of that space has ended up being lethal for, all three countries involved.
I have to say one thing. I did a number of interviews about objects on the other side in Pakistan, and I found that the issue of identity is way more complex there than it is here. Families that chose to go to the promised land, as it were, maybe not finding it up to what they believed, or maybe finding themselves in dire situations, or maybe excelling, The concept of belonging is very complex. For instance, during one of my conversations with somebody there, a man whose family had worked for the League in India. His family had worked for the League, he had worked for the League. In fact, he stayed in India till 1953 and went only after he had finished his education. And he kept saying, throughout my education in Aligarh Muslim University, I thought of Pakistan, I held the thought in my heart. And despite all that, his family couldn't leave their home. They just couldn't bear to leave. So they stayed after partition. And when I was speaking to him, just when I had really consigned himself to being a true, follower of the League and true follower of Pakistan, he says to me, but who can separate somebody from their land of their birth? And I thought, how complex is that you feel this strongly from for a nation that you essentially have built yourself. And yet you feel yourself belonging to a part that you've left behind on the other side. So I think we are able to detangle till a certain extent. But I think over there it's very difficult because there is so much silence around their notion of citizenship. Nationhood is married to citizenship there, to nation state, to two-nation theory, and to Qaeda-e-Azam. Everything is connected. It is easy to divorce yourself here.
Since you said we are not land, Japan is trying to sell nuclear power plants, America is trying to sell. In spite of all the experience that they have, you have mentioned, we have not learned from it. What, in your opinion, we should learn?
From Hiroshima or from partition?
All these things, measures that you have seen, because
Okay.
Hiroshima is from the nuclear,
Yeah.
nuclear radiation. Now, this partition is out of religious animosities, which the last speaker has said, Kavita Dhaya. We have not learned from it, you said. In your opinion, madam, what we should learn?
Okay, so one thing I'd want to say to that, first of all, is yes, there are nuclear problems going on today. There is, there is continual growth of nuclear weapons, being amassed in the world, and so on. But the point is that maybe if we had not learned from Hiroshima, if we had not had those voices, we may not even exist right now as a species. We could have already had our Third World War, but maybe there's been enough pushback, maybe there's been enough nuclear nonproliferation that it has made a difference, right? So we can't say that because there's still problems today that memorializing something has not taught us enough. And then same with the Holocaust. And then here with partition, I think, with our work, it's already creating a lot of empathy. And one can measure this, in fact, from data from social media, data from Google searches, which is data that we are compiling now and hope to publish soon. So I think that empathy building is really important. Why? Because we are putting so many resources into conflict, and yet we have so many people living in poverty and so many people who need education. What if we could reduce the amount of resources going into managing conflict and divert those resources away into more productive things? So I think those things, some of these are hard to measure, but it does not mean that there's no effect.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Gurpreet Singh. At the very outset, I'd just like to inform you that I'm a third generation, from a partition victim, and both my grandparents were partition victims. Just like to mention that during my childhood, since being the eldest grandchild, I was taken to marriages by my grandmother to Delhi and to various places. She actually loved me a lot, and during discussions, when all the relatives used to sit, they used to always speak about partition in very hushed tones. So whenever I used to enter their group or kind of intrude their they used to just keep quiet. And once I asked my grandmother, why do you all speak about this so in very quiet tones? And she said, no, it's nothing of your business and all that. So. And my grandfather, being educated, I used to have good discussions with him about partition, and he used to speak a lot about his old days. Not once did he mention about any hatred that he had about his friends or his people that he left behind. And that was very, very interesting, very, very odd to think. But once, after probing my grandmother a lot, because, I was the most loved person in the family, being the eldest, grandchild. Then she actually started crying, and and then she wouldn't speak. Then she told me that many women, many friends of hers were actually humiliated, raped. There were many rapes actually, to be very honest. And I'm sorry, I'm being a bit blunt. She would not say that, but the way she cried, and it makes me cry even now. And she said that she was almost on the verge of being raped. And she was being followed and actually by a mob. And then incidentally and very oddly, she was saved by a Maulvi from a mosque who knew her father, because my great-grandfather was a teacher in the village. And they were known to each other. So that was very odd. But then, and the biggest contradiction was that she would never go to any Muslim restaurant or eat from any Muslim hands or their food. And she scolded me that I should not go to any restaurant owned by a Muslim or eat their food. And then she said that many of our people were killed, by the Muslims. And this is what this thought I actually grew up with. And after the advent of internet, Facebook, and when I started making friends with the Pakistanis, and reading, and of course a lot of research that I did, I realized that this is all wrong. What they did and what we did were almost equal. There is no hateracy. It was just the moment that happened, and we were all like animals that, we killed each other. So I just wanted to make this point because it was very odd a moment that
I think it's one of the very, as you mentioned, one of the worst parts of partition was the violence against women. And there's no getting away from the fact that there was a lot of abduction, a lot of rape, and a lot of honor killing that happened at that time. But at the same time, in the midst of that, there were all these instances of humanity. And I think in our joint museum of objects that we've done with the Godrej Culture Lab, it's a very similar story. One of the pulkaris that if you step out and see there, it belonged to a woman who when they were traveling and trying to escape, their kafila was attacked, and so this person, Raghubir Singh Mali, he was trying to lead his family to safety. The kafila was attacked. One of his sons was killed. One of his brothers kind of fled, and they never heard from him again. All the women at that point jumped into a well. And it was a nearby Muslim landlord who heard about the incident, rushed there, rescued the women. One of the women was Raghubir's mother, Basant Kaur, and that's her pulkari that's here. She was rescued from the well. And these are not rare stories. And I think that's one of the things that we're trying to do through the museum is emphasize these stories of humanity that existed at partition. Actually, a very large percentage of people who made it to safety, who made it across to this side or that side, did so because somebody, a friend or a neighbor or a stranger, helped them. And I think that's important to remember.
So I just wanted to follow that up with a really quick insight that we've had from the archive. It's absolutely true. A lot of people that did make it over, were helped by somebody from, a friend or somebody that they knew personally who belonged to, say, a religion that should have been attacking them. But something really interesting that we're finding out is that vast majority of the people say that they did not know who their attackers were. And the people, we've also obviously interviewed people who were the attackers, and they say they usually went somewhere where they did not know the people. So it was not a very personal thing. It's not like necessarily that neighbors were killing neighbors, which is a very common interpretation that I hear about partition, a very common story I hear around partition, that neighbors suddenly started killing each other. That's actually not really true. And so it seemed to be very economically motivated, the violence, and it kind of shows you what happens when there's a very botched transfer of power from one government to the next, and your civil services, your military, police, who are supposed to be protecting the people, when they break down and they get confused which side they're belonging on, you get violence that goes out of control. And yeah.